It's time for Tipping Point. Tonight we're switching things up a little bit given current world events. I think it would be wise to use our time together tonight to take a deep dive into the last 30 years of American foreign policy to explain how it put Russia and Ukraine on the collision course for war. So tonight we will have one very knowledgeable guest for the entirety of the hour to give you the play-by-play for Mr. New World Order Bush 41 all the way down to Biden. No stone will be left unturned. I'm your host, Karen McKinney, and this is Tipping Point. So before we get into this wide-ranging interview, I want to first give some updates on peace talks between Russia and Ukraine taking place in Istanbul, Turkey. We are hearing tonight that Russia's military is announcing drastic reductions in operations near the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv and the northern city of Chernihiv. A potential deal in the works would likely see Ukraine vowing to not join NATO or to allow foreign military bases on their land and to forego development of nuclear weapons. In exchange, Russia may allow Ukraine to pursue joining the European Union, which Kyiv wants to have included in that some security guarantees from the West. However, sticking points in the peace talks appear to include control over Crimea and the Donbass region, which Russia wants Ukraine to formally recognize as being Russian territory. These developments in the peace talks are being reported as a glimmer of hope, given the carnage we've seen so far in this war. And in some respects, it is. No one wants the situation to go on indefinitely. But it also begs the question, why weren't these issues solved diplomatically beforehand? Why did so many people have to die just to bring us back around full circle, back to discussions about NATO expansion eastward, which is what every major diplomat, left, right, and center, had warned about over these last 30 years? And that is the question I want to get to tonight. Because this war is often painted as one between democracy and autocracy, of good versus evil, despite the fact that, as some have pointed out, that in relative terms, by some analyses, Hungary is more free and transparent than Ukraine. Yet the American left hates the former and props up the latter as an irreproachable paragon of virtue that should set off some alarm bells that things aren't exactly what they seem. That, like in the lead up to the war in Iraq, our feelings of patriotism and of wanting to do good in the world are being used against us. And while morality itself is binary, humans, on the other hand, are very complex beings, and nation states even more so. Our motives and actions are almost never so black and white. Just think about your own personal triumphs and also your own personal shortcomings. In fact, here's President Trump explaining back in 2017 his reasoning for why he was not gunning for the same war with Russia, proxy or otherwise, that Hillary Clinton was suggesting during their 2016 presidential debates. Take a look.
Do you respect Putin?
I do respect him.
Do you? Why?
Well, I respect a lot of people, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get along with him. He's a leader of his country. I say it's better to get along with Russia than not. And if Russia helps us in the fight against ISIS, which is a major fight, and Islamic terrorism all over the world,
right,
major fight, that's a good thing. Will I get along with him? I have no idea. It's very
He's a
possible
killer,
I
though.
won't.
Putin's a killer.
A lot of killers. We got a lot of killers. Why, you think our country's so innocent? Do you think our country's so innocent?
I don't know of any government leaders that are killers in America.
Well, take a look at what we've done, too. We've made a lot of mistakes. I've been against the war in Iraq from the beginning.
Yeah, mistakes are different than...
A lot of mistakes, okay, but a lot of people were killed. So a lot of killers around, believe me.
Now, of course, none of this is to justify Russia's invasion, because in this situation, they are the aggressor whose direct actions have led to the deaths of many innocents, and those actions still are. My guests and I are both unified in our condemnations of Moscow's actions. But what we also argue is that it was our government, from Bush 41 to Biden, who played a huge role in using Ukraine to break Russia. And what that means is that the D.C. Beltway swamp gambled with the lives and homelands of innocent Ukrainians, many of whom are the descendants of those who suffered actual genocide under the hands of the Soviets. And now the D.C. cartel gets to play the hero to the victims they created. Here to help me expose this tangled web we've weaved is tonight's special guest, author Scott Horton. He's the editorial director of antiwar.com, and he's the director of the Libertarian Institute. Thanks for being here tonight, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. So even though we have the whole hour together, there's still so much to get to and not enough time to do it. So let's try and do this in chronological order, at least somewhat. So Scott, take us back to the beginnings of the 1990s with President George H.W. Bush and the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
I will. First, if you'd allow, I'd like to agree with what you just said there and emphasize that I'm an American. I'm a Texan, even better. And I don't care for Russia. I'm not taking their side. These are not Putin's talking points or anything like that. But as Donald Trump indicated in that clip, our government is run by people who make bad decisions a lot of times. And in fact, a lot of the story we're going to be talking about tonight, our current President Joe Biden was at least kind of riding shotgun along with the policy all along in the Clinton years, in the Bush years as senator, and then in the Obama years as vice president. And then, of course, his family scandals were all caught up in the Trump years, and now he's the president. So if I told you that Joe Biden and his friends Bill Clinton and George W. Bush and Barack Obama made some bad decisions in their East European policy, you would have to admit that that sounds possible, right? That's not America, and that's not all of our sin and burden and guilt. That is to say, we've had some very lousy leaders making some very lousy decisions over this time, and we have to be honest about that so that we can make proper decisions about our country's role in the world. And if we're, going off of just false narratives off of all the TV channels instead of the real facts in the background, then we're going to continue to make matters worse, most likely. And of course, as we see, if you turn on CNN or MSNBC or Fox News most of the time, the narrative is history began the other day when the evil bad man Putin did an evil bad thing, because that's what evil men do. And the thing is, that's just not good enough. So I appreciate you having me on here to talk about the context here. But I just want people to understand, too, I know you have a right-leaning and patriotic audience, and I'm a Ron Paul guy. I'm not anti-American. I'm pro-American, and that's why I'm like this, just so we're all clear on that.
And thank you for clearing that up. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for letting me. So now, very quickly, I'll try to do this in the bullet point fashion because this is TV timing here. H.W. Bush oversaw really the end of the Cold War there. Ronald Reagan had really kicked off all the negotiations and the warming of things up at the end of his administration, his second term. It was really H.W. Bush who got the job done in negotiating not just an end of the Cold War, but also, standing by and not applying pressure while the Soviet Union was dismantled from within. And, part of that was he even gave what was famously called the Chicken Kiev speech, where he went to Kiev and he warned, in his words, very closely paraphrasing here, that independence and freedom are not the same thing. And if Ukraine is going to break away from Moscow, it's going to do so on Moscow's timetable. And America does not support an effort to replace a far-off tyranny with a local despotism. And he warned against what he called the divisive and destructive nature of ethnic hatreds that could be stirred in Ukraine, and he warned against those kinds of things coming to the fore. Now, as you know, H.W. Bush had been the head of the CIA, and he must have known the history of CIA intervention in Ukraine during the battle days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where they supported some very far right-wing forces. In fact, people who had been allied with the Nazis fighting against the communists in Ukraine during World War II. And so the CIA had used them before. Bush certainly knew the deep history of American intervention in Ukraine and its relationship with the government in Moscow and so forth, and was very wary about getting America too involved in that. Now, the Hawks call that the Chicken Kiev speech because he should have been dancing on the Soviets' grave at the time, they said. But in fact, his refusal to do so is what actually allowed the Soviet Union to fall apart. If he'd been dancing on the Berlin Wall, as he put it, then that might have really prevented them. That might have strengthened hardliners' position and prevented the reformers from actually getting rid of the USSR for us. So now, here's an important point, though. As the USSR was dissolving, Mikhail Gorbachev, he essentially let all of Eastern Europe go. The Soviet Union occupied all the land all the way halfway across Germany. And he pulled the Russian army, essentially the Soviet army, all the way back behind the Ural Mountains and just dissolved the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. Now, in order to get him to agree to do that, the Bush administration, and along with the British and the French and the Germans at the time, all repeatedly promised the Russians that America will not expand the NATO alliance east of Germany. And then in the Clinton years, they broke that. And for very reckless and kind of personal reasons, as Justice Raimondo said in his theory of libertarian realism, all foreign policy is tied up in domestic politics. So it wasn't the brilliant grand strategists that wanted to expand NATO. The brilliant grand strategists were all against it. They all said it would be an unnecessary provocation against Russia. But Lockheed and the special interests and the Democratic pollsters said we could collect more Polish votes in Illinois, right? And these kind of politics came into play. Lockheed dollars, special interest dollars, and particular ethnicities in certain places voting for these and those politicians really drove the push for NATO expansion in the 1990s. Now, combined with Clinton's horrible shock therapy policy that they used to really kick the Russians while they were down, not help them become a rich, prosperous, capitalist country like ours, but essentially to bankrupt them, destroy their currency, hand their industry over to a few connected gangsters, and really ruin their country. This is a huge issue that is hardly ever talked about, but it was a major issue. And then, of course, two major Balkan wars in Bosnia and in the Kosovo War of 1999, in the first one, 94, 95, and then the Kosovo War of 99. In both cases, took the side against the Serbs, the Russians' ethnic kin, the Slavs, and their very close allies, essentially over Russia's dead body. Now, here the Americans are insisting that, yes, we're expanding our military alliance into Eastern Europe, but we promise this is just about spreading peace and security and liberty and the Pax Americana, right, rather than trying to threaten Russia. But then what's the first thing they do? They launch an aggressive war in the name of intervening in a civil war. It's not that Serbia had invaded Kosovo. Kosovo was part of Serbia. This was a civil war, and they couldn't get a UN Security Council resolution because, of course, Russia could have vetoed it on the Security Council. So they just broke the law. And NATO launched this war against Kosovo in 1999. So these are all major steps. Clinton also covertly supported the Chechen insurgency against the Russians in 1999 and 2000, the Second Chechen War. And this is how Putin came to power, was by winning that war, and then became named prime minister. And then later on New Year's Eve 99, Yeltsin resigned and turned power over to him. So this is blowback from America's policies in the 1990s in Eastern Europe. And again, I have to emphasize, I keep saying America, but I mean the American government. I mean the government of William Jefferson Clinton, the guy that butchered the babies in Waco, the guy who bombed Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia for 8 years straight, leading to the al-Qaeda attack on our towers on September 11th. Blowback from his horrible Middle East policy for his entire administration. Well, the same guy set us about on a policy of expanding our military empire into Eastern Europe in a way that then ended up leading to all of this blowback and consequences from his actions. And we should not be surprised.
We should not be. And like you were saying, Boris Yeltsin, that was someone else that Bill Clinton, they helped to prop up in the elections. I mean, in Russia, of course, unfortunately, that part of the world has dealt with a lot of corruption. But for even them, they would say Yeltsin was even corrupt for their own standards. So unfortunately, that says a lot about what the U.S. was doing in that part of the world. And like you said, Yeltsin then names Putin as his successor. But Scott, we're coming up on the break here, so don't go anywhere. And coming up next, we pick up this conversation in the new millennium, the 21st century, full of color revolutions and threats of burying the Russians under the mountains to Georgia. All that and more. That's after the break. Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney, and we are once again joined by tonight's special guest, Scott Horton, whose many titles include being director of the Libertarian Institute. He's here with us for the whole hour, and you won't want to miss any of it. We're now transitioning from the 1990s into the beginnings of the new millennium. So, Scott, let's pick up with the presidency of George W. Bush and the further expansion of NATO. So explain for us what Bush's attitude and really his VP Dick Cheney's attitude were toward Russia during those two terms.
All right, so W. Bush comes in, and in July of 2001, Putin reiterates that we really don't like this NATO expansion. But, if you're going to expand NATO, why don't you let us join? And, Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, essentially just brushed him off. They say they have this open door policy to NATO, but they don't really mean that. They don't want Russia. Now, on September 11th, Vladimir Putin was the very first foreign leader to call W. Bush and say, not only my condolences, but I am your humble servant. In fact, he opened up Russian airspace to America and promised, I think probably before even contacting them, that you can use former Soviet bases in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in order to invade Afghanistan. Remember, it was America that was switching sides in the Afghan war, not Russia. So he said, hey, you want to come and keep the Taliban down? Be my guest. And in fact, he was said, reported credibly to have had to face down more right-wing forces in his government and in his military to do so. But he said, no, I want to take this chance to make friends with W. Bush and get this, new presidency off on the right foot. Well, W. Bush repaid him by tearing up the anti-ballistic missile treaty just 3 months later, in December of 2001. And that anti-ballistic missile treaty had been, I believe, originally the brainchild of the Eisenhower administration, Ike Eisenhower, way back when. And essentially, if we make anti-missile missiles, they just make more missiles. And it's all just a game of escalation and brinksmanship and arms racing. And at some point, they decided, let's just call this off and let's cap the number of missiles that we have and let's not do missile defense. Because, again, it doesn't really make you impregnable to nuclear attack. It just means that the other side has to try harder to make even more weapons. And this is something we should avoid, this kind of escalation spiral from the battle days of the Cold War with the Communist Soviet Union, which is now dead and gone 30 years, right? At that point, had been dead and gone more than a decade, right? So Bush, though, simply because of corruption, decided, no, we want to tear up this treaty so that we can shovel a bunch of American tax money into these firms that make these supposed anti-missile missiles. Well, I got to tell you, they don't work. They never work. The only time they ever shot down a missile with a missile was an absolute prearranged hit, where the target missile was exactly where it was supposed to be on time to make the connection and everything. The only real way to take out incoming H-bombs, coming over the poles, is with H-bombs in space, full-scale thermonuclear war in space to try to knock out incoming nukes. And that's what we do not have. So the whole thing is just a boondoggle. It doesn't work anyway. But Putin warned that you give me no choice. Now I'm going to have to escalate. And we saw in 2018 in his State of the Nation speech, he debuted an entire new generation of nuclear weapons, new heavy missiles that go around the South Pole and carry enough warheads to kill every major city in Texas with just one missile from multiple reentry vehicles, a nuclear-powered torpedo and that carries an H-bomb that could kill any American naval or shipping port anywhere in the world. They claimed a nuclear-powered cruise missile that essentially has unlimited range, could fly around the world and go, the back way around any defenses we might have to take out any target they want. And, of course, the new hypersonics, which go, at least above Mach 5, and Putin claimed in his speech above Mach 10. And that can reduce warning time on the threat of an incoming missile like that from less than 30 minutes to decide what to do to less than 5. A missile fire from the North Atlantic would hit Washington, D.C. in no time. They'd have no time to decide what to do other than just hit the panic button and kill us all. And so in that speech, Putin said, I tried to tell you not to do this, and you wouldn't listen, but I bet you'll listen now. And, of course, W. Bush was painting his toes that day in the mirror or something and didn't have to take responsibility whatsoever for what he had done there in absolutely unnecessarily escalating the arms race. And see, part of that was installing these anti-missile missiles in Romania and Poland. But the thing is, there's, again, not enough to shoot down an incoming salvo from the Russians. And Bush said that This isn't for Russia at all. This is to protect Poland from Iran. But Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, or missiles to attach them to that could possibly attack Poland. And why would Iran attack Poland? And the whole thing was completely ridiculous. So that raised the question of why were they doing this other than just to steal money from the American people? It looked like one of the possible reasons was to sneakily break our mid-range missile treaty, the INF treaty, and install dual-use missile launchers in Romania and Poland that fire anti-missile missiles, but they also, these Mk-41 missile launchers, can be configured to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with H-bombs. And so Putin complained bitterly that, you know, what is this supposed to look like to me? It's I love your assurances. Believe me, I like you and trust you, but my job is to take this at face value for what it is. You're moving an offensive strike capability closer and closer to my country. Please stop it. And he said it over and over and over again. Now, I'm sorry, I'm trying to hurry. In 2008, Bush, over the Germans' objections, promised he didn't bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, but he promised that he would put them on the fast track. This is the Bucharest Declaration. And the CIA warned him not to do it, and the ambassador of Russia, William Burns, warned Condoleezza Rice not to do it. Look it up in the WikiLeaks. Niet means niet from February 1st, 2008, and they did it anyway. And just a couple of months later, Georgia, who were also part of that, launched a war to reconquer the breakaway province of South Ossetia. But there were Russian peacekeepers there under a deal brokered with the EU, and they were killed. And this led to the Russians then responding, crossing the Caucasus Mountains and forcing the Georgians back out of South Ossetia at high cost to the Georgians. And at that time, it was reported from two different credible reports that Dick Cheney, the vice president, promoted strikes on the Russian forces coming through what's called the Roki Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains into Georgia. And that Bush and Stephen Hadley, the national security advisor, thankfully said absolutely not, forget it, Cheney, and they didn't do that. But it was only George W. Bush's cool, patient wisdom that protected us from nuclear Armageddon, from a guy who was just literally one heartbeat away from the job himself. And so that's the kind of danger that they're playing with. Imagine being in a border dispute with Russia in the Caucasus Mountains between the Black and Caspian Sea. Over a threat that we would bring them into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or a promise that we would, that seemed to, spur the Georgian leader to wage that attack. A Georgian leader who, by the way, was put in power in one of those color-coded revolutions you mentioned, the Rose Revolution of 2003. So he was an illegitimate American-backed coup d'etat leader in the first place, who then started this war, almost got us into a war with Russia. So there's nothing like the interests of the American people being protected here at all. This is all just like crazy pet projects of American militarists, arms manufacturers, and imperial ideologues who believe that everywhere they interfere, they spread peace and freedom. But, you know, there's about 2 million dead Arabs who could tell you otherwise from the last 20 years.
Well, that's exactly right. It almost feels like Icarus sometimes, flying too close to the sun and then, being burned up. I feel like these politicians, they see the world, lives like you and I as just little, pieces to be moving on a chessboard, because really, when they make these gambles, they don't pay the price. It's like you said, the innocents around the world in all these different countries, they're the ones who end up paying the price. But that's all the time we have for this segment, so we have to quickly go to break. So stick around, Scott. When we come back, the political intrigue and espionage really starts heating up with the onset of the Obama-Biden years. How their State Department was able to get caught red-handed planning a coup in Ukraine and still getting away with it. Perhaps it had something to do with Joe Biden's son Hunter getting a high-paying energy job out of all of it. That's all happening after the break. Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. Tonight's guest, Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute, hasn't gone anywhere, and we hope you haven't either. Before we pick up our conversation once more, I want to play for you this clip of Biden from over the weekend, because it'll set the tone for the topic of regime change. Take a look.
Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia, for free people refused to live in a world of hopelessness and darkness. We will have a different future, a brighter future, rooted in democracy and principles, hope and light, of decency and dignity, of freedom and possibilities. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
Well, Biden's own White House aides tried to walk back his comments. Biden now says he makes no apologies, and in direct contradiction to his staff says he's not walking anything back. So let's get into it, Scott, by going back a decade to the infamous F the EU tape and the 2014 color revolution in Ukraine during the Obama-Biden years. What does our audience need to know about that whole situation?
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, the color revolutions really started under Bill Clinton and continued through W. Bush. They overthrew the government in Serbia. They overthrew the government in Georgia. They tried in Belarus in 2005. They did the Orange Revolution successfully under W. Bush in 2004. They failed in Lebanon with the Cedar Revolution. They temporarily succeeded in Kyrgyzstan in 2005 there for a little while. And they had their short-lived Green Revolution in Iran. This is all the same group of guys, you know, as the people are watching the terrible Iraq war unfolding in front of their eyes. You have the CIA, NED, and NGO coalition going around doing these color-coded coups. Essentially what happens is the template is dispute an election, even if you lose it, and just absolutely refuse, stay out there until the other side finally gives in, backs down, compromises, and then just continue to push until you overthrow them. And they, you know, succeeded about, you know, a third of the time, I guess, but they kept trying it. Now, so they did this in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, and they succeeded in stopping Yanukovych from taking office after he won that election. Then the people who the Americans put in power there, Yushchenko and Timoshenko, were such basket cases and so corrupt that Yanukovych won again in 2010 in what was considered a free and fair election by our partners in the European Union. And then what happened was in 2013, he was to sign a trade deal with the European Union. And at the last minute, the Western side changed the deal and added all kinds of new austerity measures and new loans and all these restrictions on him having another deal with the Russians and so forth. And Yanukovych said then, I feel like a bride who showed up at my wedding to be greeted with a prenuptial agreement. And now I'm not so sure I'm in the mood and even want to marry you anymore at all. Something like that. So then, and now this is a guy who they say, oh, he was just a Putin puppet and a pro-Russian, this and that. That wasn't really right. He was trying to actually tread a pretty neutral course and was even leaning toward the European Union and had been facing down people in his government that did not want to lean toward the European Union. But they essentially gave him an offer he couldn't accept, whether deliberately or not, I'm not sure. But that led to this massive protest movement in Kiev by the pro-Western forces in the western half of the country and who are essentially nationalists, whether they're pro-EU or not, very nationalist and very anti-Russian. And they started this massive protest movement. And then millions of dollars poured in from the West and through these NGOs and through the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute and International Republican Institute and so forth. And Obama administration officials like Victoria Nuland and senators like John McCain and Chris Murphy went and traveled there to give cookies and sandwiches to people on the Maidan. And someone was paying millions of dollars to keep them entertained, to keep them fed, to keep their porta potty service, to keep them warm in the Ukrainian winter out there for months. From November through February, they protested. Then there's the F the EU phone call you alluded to there. Now, this is approximately 2 weeks before the coup, which took place on the night of the 21st, 22nd of February, 2014. Approximately 2 weeks before that, presumably the Russians intercepted this call and put it on the internet. And it's Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, the very important neoconservative theoretician. His wife, who is the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, essentially like an ambassador to the European Union kind of a position. And she's on the phone with Jeffrey Pyatt, the ambassador to Ukraine. And they're essentially plotting who is going to make up the new government once it takes over. And they're clearly plotting the coup. They talk about, we got to bring in this and that guy to midwife it and glue it and make it stick and all these things. They're not waiting for the next election. They're talking about overthrowing the government. And they're deciding who should be in the positions of power. Now, famously, Victoria Nuland on this private phone call used a bad word, the F word. And so all the headlines were easy. Diplomat uses bad word. Well, she shouldn't do that. But why was she saying F the EU? They're our buddies. The answer is because the Germans were reluctant to do this coup. The Germans were trying to find a compromise, and they were slow walking the thing. And she's telling her counterpart, well, F the EU. We'll just do it ourselves. And that's why she's working with this guy, Robert Sari from the UN. And that's why she just got off the phone with Jake Sullivan, our current national security advisor, who was then Vice President Biden's national security advisor. He previously had been Hillary Clinton's man at state in the first Obama term. This is in the second Obama term. And she says, I just got off the phone with Jake Sullivan, and he confirms that Biden has agreed he will do, we're going to do a conference telephone call tomorrow with the participants so that he can give them an attaboy and make the deets stick. Deets meaning details, in order to just get everybody corralled on board and make them understand. The big guy says, this is what we're doing and all of that. So there it was, caught red-handed. And then what they do? They did the coup anyway. And what they did, and this is really bad, and this is only like 99% proven. We don't know 100%, but I think so. Do the deep research on this, and you'll see that it was far right-wing forces, the right sector and Svoboda Party, who are literal Nazis. Not just, in America now, everybody on the right is a Nazi. I don't mean that. I mean real white supremacists, proud descendants of the Galatian SS that fought on the side of the Germans during World War II. And they were the ones who were leading the effort in the Maidan Square there. And what happened was they hired snipers to come in and start killing protesters in order, as a false flag attack, in order to drive the crowd into a frenzy and the entire thing into a fever pitch. And in order to then put Yanukovych in the position of signing this deal, promising new elections and that he would step down and pull back his police forces. Well, once he did so, the Nazis just seized all the government buildings. A group called C14, which stands for the 14 famous words of the slogan of the white supremacists, and along with right sector. And they just seized all the buildings in Kiev, the government buildings, and forced Yanukovych to flee. And that led then directly to the Russian seizure of the Crimean Peninsula, which had really belonged to Russia since 1783 anyway, but then led to the terrible war in the Donbass, which the worst of the fighting in the far east of Ukraine there, by the people who had supported Yanukovych and rejected the new regime. Something like 10 to 14,000 of them were killed in the war as the government in Kiev invaded. And then the Russians sent special operations, essentially deniable special operations forces, to help those separatists in the east to fend off the government in Kiev. And then that led to the Minsk II peace deal, which was never fully implemented and which comes obviously back up and as this whole thing comes to a head in the Biden years. But I guess we got to do Trump first.
That we do. And quickly, just a minute or two before I have to let you go for this upcoming break. During the same period of time, we saw the Obama administration, they tried to do their famous reset with Russia and relations. We saw Putin even step down I know he was still the power behind Medvedev, but he did somewhat step down. But you also talked about how it seems that while he was stepping down, we kind of humiliated Russia on the world stage when it came to Libya. So if for a minute or two, you could recap that situation for us.
Sure. Yeah, that was the biggest deal. So Putin, for a dictator, did step down to be the prime minister for a while and let his right-hand man, Medvedev, be president. And Hillary famously did the big red reset button with Sergei Lavrov and said, now we can try to get along. And then the first thing she did was play Medvedev like a sucker and promise him that if you vote for this UN resolution, or at least abstain on this UN resolution, we're going to launch a no-fly zone in Libya to protect the people of Benghazi, who are all sure to be exterminated by Gaddafi any day now, which was a total hoax in the first place. But then, once they passed the resolution, the Americans and their allies in Britain and France immediately turned the war into a full-scale regime change war. It lasted 9 months, and they went all the way to Tripoli, of course, and Gaddafi was lynched on the side of the road, and Hillary Clinton cackled, we came, we saw, he died. And she made a chump out of Medvedev. That here America turned Libya into another Iraq, and this time they got the Russians to go along with it on the UN Security Council in a way that never happened in 2002 and 2003. And so this completely discredited Medvedev, and instead of him possibly doing 2 terms in power and maybe passing on power to someone else from there, I mean, Putin clearly is a strong man and somewhat of an autocrat, but he also could have named himself Tsar 20 years ago. He clearly, at least up until now, has seemed to have wanted to leave something like a Republican form of government behind him. FDR was president for life, but he didn't overthrow the Constitution entirely. We had regular elections after that, right? And so it looked like he was possibly even stepping down and letting Medvedev and others take power. But he said, apparently, nope, if you want the job done right, you have to do it yourself, and came back to the presidency after only one term. And so now is the stronger and more resentful strongman that we're dealing with today. And what good did anyone get out of the war in Libya? Nothing other than ISIS and Al-Qaeda's friends there, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and so forth. But Hillary didn't even run on it in 2016, which was the reason she did it, because by then it was such a humiliation, she preferred that everyone forget the whole thing. And when someone brought it up at a debate, she blamed the whole thing on Barack Obama, said she had nothing to do with it.
And don't you just love going back through all of this in the same way that Bush says Iraq is now liberated, Iraq is free? Of course, he said that almost 20 years ago. I mean, today, is Iraq really that free? Same thing with Obama. When you look through some of the comments he was making when the Libyan war was playing out, and he was saying that we're doing this for the people of Libya, we're saving them. And then, of course, everyone goes quiet, like you said, because it goes to, hell in a handbasket in 2017. Actual chattel slavery makes a comeback in Libya. Like you said, these different radical Islamic terror groups make a comeback, and everyone just kind of looks the other way, and it's now a failed state. Are the people of Libya really better off now? Obviously, not exactly. But Scott, we'll have to pick this up after the break. And up next, we revisit the Russiagate hoax and how it further soured relations with Russia and Ukraine. That's coming up after the break. Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. As promised, we still have Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute, with us. And we're now moving our conversation into the Trump years and how the Russiagate hoax and the Ukraine impeachment sham further soured U.S.-Russian relations. So, Scott, some say the intel community and the Obama administration went all in on the Russia hoax conspiracy theory, not just for their own political gain, but also to make it nearly impossible for President Trump to establish friendlier relations with Russia. What are your thoughts on that?
No question about that. Listen, this is one of the things that absolutely made them panic. That original clip that you just played where he told Bill O'Reilly, you think our country's so innocent? I mean, this is just absolutely sacrilege to the American empire that you could compare the consequences of their well-meaning behavior with the evilness of an evildoer who does evil things. And for him to make that moral equivalence was one of the things that made them just absolutely decide that this man cannot be the president. And here's the other thing. There are people in American foreign policy circles, it's a minority certainly now, who have said that the enemy is China, and so we should befriend Russia to balance against China. The same way we split China away from Russia back when the Soviet Union was the more powerful partner, and we broke away, 50 years ago. Nixon went and shook hands with Mao and opened up China in order to weaken the Soviet Union. And so there are people who propose to play that same game. And I think Donald Trump quite credibly claimed that he met with Henry Kissinger, the man who engineered the Sino-Soviet split of 1972 through 4 there. And that Kissinger told him, yes, Donald Trump, you're the tallest, richest, smartest guy I've ever met, because I agree with you that this would be the right thing to do, would be to get closer to Russia. First of all, to prevent them from getting closer to China, but also then to use them even to balance against China. So this is simply a difference of opinion within the foreign policy establishment. And again, Trump had a minority view. Now, my view is complete non-interventionism. I'm not taking a side in that hunt, but I'm just saying Donald Trump was not subservient to Russia. He was not loyal to Russia. He was not gay in love with Vladimir Putin, the way all the liberals accused him, which, boy, they'll call you a homophobe for the slightest infraction, but they can make those jokes all day. None of that was ever right. Donald Trump, of course, is an American patriot in his own reckoning and what he thinks is right for the United States of America. And his policy is an America First policy in his mind anyway, as many terrible negative consequences he made, especially on Yemen and things like that, notwithstanding. But so that was his motive. But then Hillary Clinton was in trouble, right? Because they had the DNC leak. And so here you have Trump spouting a policy that she, finds to be absolutely abhorrent, right? And she's caught red-handed rigging the election against Bernie Sanders and all these things. So her campaign, and we know this now, for a fact. It was obvious then, but now we know it's true. Her campaign hired this law firm to hire, 1, the dirty tricksters who did the Steele dossier, and 2, the dirty tricksters who claimed that the Russians did the DNC hack and gave all the stuff to WikiLeaks. None of that was ever true. That was the origin of it. Then the FBI and the CIA, the FBI Counterintelligence Division, and the CIA and the National Intelligence Directorate, and eventually the leaders of the FBI and the Justice Department, they went all in on this hoax. And they knew they were lying from the very beginning. And not to go too far into it, but one of the absolute hinges of their entire story was that Carter Page was a Russian spy handling Trump. Carter Page was a loyal CIA asset, they finally admitted years later, and who always, informed the CIA whenever he did business with any important or powerful person in Russia, in government or in business whatsoever. They knew they were lying the whole time. And as the FBI told CNN at one point, that they figured, well, if we can't overthrow him with the 25th Amendment, these are America's secret police, the FBI Counterintelligence Division, completely unaccountable, said, well, if we can't overthrow him with the 25th Amendment, which the 25th Amendment does not say you can do a coup if you want, read it carefully, then at least we can rein him in. That's the quote. We can rein him in. And that meant prevent him from ending America's new Cold War with Russia. And now here's the problem. Donald Trump was severely under pressure from this Russiagate hoax, and he didn't handle it in a proper way. He essentially let them run roughshod over him for 2 straight years, almost 3 straight years, with this phony investigation. And there's at least one direct quote of his son saying, boy, well, they say that we're pro-Russian traitors. Well, now we're giving all these weapons to Ukraine. And so that proves that we're not. Right? Because it's very kind of two-dimensional thinking. But unfortunately, this was kind of how they could prove that they weren't pro-Russian traitors, was by going along with this policy of arming the military in Ukraine. But Kara, Obama, the first black president to support a Nazi coup in Kiev, was also terrified to arm these Nazi-infested military forces. And they truly are. Putin says that's a good enough reason to invade. I am not saying that. But I am saying they're a good enough reason to not support the Ukrainian armed forces, which are infested with these groups. And Obama was afraid to send them weapons. He sent them trucks and Rangers to train, but no guns. And Trump started flowing in the Lockheed products, the Javelin anti-tank missiles and the rest of this stuff. And he also, and I don't know if this is his, hawkish policy or if it's just he had no control over his Pentagon at all, but they vastly increased harassment of the Russians by air and sea with their naval presence in the Baltic and Black and Okhotsk seas. That's in the Far East, north of Korea there. And also bomber flights right up to 12.5 miles off of their coast over and over again, essentially practicing like a nuclear first strike and testing their defenses and this kind of thing. If the Russians were doing this off the coast of California, we'd be at DEFCON 1. And we expect them to just put up with this constantly. And now one thing I kind of skipped over for time here is that during Bush and during Obama, they continued to expand NATO. They now brought in, 4 or 5 more countries. And under Trump, they brought in 2 more, Macedonia and Montenegro. And so now then, do we have time to do Hunter Biden here real quick?
About a minute or so, yeah.
Okay, so Donald Trump was literally impeached, the 3rd president ever, for temporarily holding up an arms deal to Ukraine because he rightfully wanted, although for his own purposes, but still, he wasn't obstructing justice. He was trying to kick justice into gear to get the Ukrainians to investigate Hunter Biden and his corrupt connection to this company, Burisma. Now, Burisma was tight with the government that Biden, Sr., Joe, had overthrown. So they were afraid of the new government. That was why they hired Hunter Biden, was as an insurance policy to protect them from persecution by the new regime. That was the origin of that. And all the fact checkers say that no, all the investigations into Burisma were dormant and closed down. And so when Joe got the prosecutor fired, that wasn't obstruction of justice at all. Well, that's not true. And the great journalist Matt Taibbi, who speaks Russian and does real work, he did the work and showed there were multiple investigations into Burisma, some of which very much were open. And the prosecutor that Biden had fired was not the most corrupt prosecutor. The guy that replaced him was far more corrupt. So their whole narrative about what happened there is just not true, no matter how final they say their judgment is on that. And they were paying Hunter Biden a cool $1 million a year, essentially, to try to keep the new regime off their back. Now, what did they do? Did they hire the brother of the new prime minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, America put in power? No, they hired the son of the vice president of the United States because they heard Victoria Nuland say He's the one running this thing out of the vice president's office. You want an insurance policy? I hear that Hunter Biden is smoking crack and collecting dollars. Let's put him on our payroll. And that's exactly what they did.
Scott, you're a wealth of knowledge. One last segment to go. And after the break, we've nearly reached the finish line on tonight's special on Ukraine. If you liked what you've heard so far, be sure to stay with us because we'll be back in 2. Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. I want to thank everyone for watching tonight and to Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute, for sticking around for this whole hour as we wrap up this deep dive. So, Scott, I know we're almost out of time here, and I really appreciate you joining us tonight. So if you could, give us a quick recap of Biden's first year in office and also what Russia could have or should have done to avoid this war.
All right, so Biden came in and severely ramped up weapons transfers and sales, and he severely ramped up the Air Force and naval presence in the Black, Baltic, and Okhotsk Seas, which are massive provocations. And then in the fall, they signed this new memorandum of understanding. I'm sorry, I forgot the exact title of it right now. Essentially, declaring that, yes, we still intend to bring Ukraine into NATO and that nobody can ever stop that. So, and that was actually after Putin started building up his forces. Now, to be perfectly clear about this, I am saying that Putin's demands and even, the reasons that he claims for why he invaded are all rational. I am not saying they're reasonable as far as being excuses for his aggressive invasion. That is not the case. But I am saying that this is not the ravings of some madman. If you just read the actual speeches of February 21st and 24th, they're quite clear. In fact, you go to December, he proposed a new treaty, and the new treaty was full of pretty much reasonable terms. I'm not saying America had to sign off on it right now, but it was absolutely a reasonable basis to sit down and talk about it. And the Americans essentially refused to give in what are, completely unreasonable ways. For example, Biden said, look, we're not going to bring Ukraine into NATO. We have no intention of bringing Ukraine into NATO. Everybody knows the Germans won't let us anyway. And so don't worry about that. Well, Putin said, put it in writing. And Biden said, absolutely not. That would violate the sacred principle that there's an open door to NATO. Again, Russia's not allowed in, but there's an open door to NATO and no one can ever close that door. Now, this is completely made up, right? This is just jargon. This means nothing. They can close the door themselves. But instead, they're saying this is a sacred principle. They refuse to give in. Then Putin says, I'm really concerned you might put medium-range nuclear missiles in Ukraine at some point, or at least dual-use launchers that could be a threat like you've done in Poland. Biden says, well, we have no intention of doing that. So Putin says, all right, so why don't you get back into the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty? Supposedly Donald Trump is the worst person ever, and he tore it up just 1.5 years ago. Nothing sacred about him tearing up that treaty. Let's get back into the treaty. It kept medium-range nuclear missiles out of Europe for 30 years. It's Ronald Reagan's great treaty. Let's get back to that. And Biden said, nope. Can't do that. Continue just sending in arms and encouraging the Ukrainians also to be essentially belligerent and refuse to compromise on anything. Putin also wanted recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea, which that ship has sailed. If they didn't want to lose Crimea, they shouldn't have overthrown the government in Kiev in 2014. I don't know what else to tell you. But as long as Russia exists, they're going to own Crimea. That's just the way that is. And anyway, the point being, they could have negotiated. And they refused to. And instead, they just ramped up tensions. And I now believe that they wanted the war to happen, at least as a plan B that they were not too reluctant to see. And in fact, as they told it to the New York Times in December, that yes, we're trying to talk Putin out of this. They weren't willing to negotiate in good faith a way out of this. They were willing to threaten him that you better not. But then they said, but if he does, then we want to replicate the dirty war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We want to replicate, imagine this, Obama's dirty war in Syria in the 2010s that led to the rise of the caliphate, that led to the return of Russia to the Middle East to just help destroy that caliphate and al-Qaeda in Syria. And imagine them saying, after we just finished losing the Afghan war as the consequence of the previous intervention there, just only 6 months ago, they got the word Afghanistan in their mouth again. But now it's not that we can't ever leave. It's that we want to replicate that absolute tragedy and catastrophe for the people of Ukraine. And they will fight, apparently, to the last Ukrainian. And that is why, as we record this, it is March 29th. The last time that our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, talked with Sergei Lavrov was on February the 15th. And I am sorry, ma'am, but when each side in this conflict, in this proxy conflict right on Russia's border, is sitting on a stockpile of 6,000 hydrogen bombs, that policy of Biden and Blinken to prolong the war, to try to support an insurgency, to, in their words, bleed Russia, to weaken Russia, or even lead to the downfall of the Putin regime, that is treason against the American people and against all of mankind. People may not understand. Any real war between America and Russia will almost certainly turn to general nuclear war within days. There's just, once we get to that point, there are so few off-ramps from general nuclear war. And that means, for all intents and purposes, the end of the world. That means billions of dead. It means our civilization and theirs, and probably most of all of Europe, wiped off the face of the earth. And it means that the rest of mankind will starve under nuclear winter. And they're playing around like they're just messing with Saddam Hussein, who they know cannot fight back, as much as they pretend to be afraid of him and preempting him. But Russia can fight back. And America has pushed this way too far in their sphere of influence. We should never have been the dominant power in Europe or Asia, and certainly not now, 30 years after the end of Soviet communism. It's time for America first. It's time for America to come home.
Scott, thank you so much for your sobering analysis tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Kara.
Thank you. And with that, I'm all out of time for tonight. Hopefully you learned something interesting to take with you into tomorrow, which is when we'll be back with our normal schedule with the History Spotlight and all. Until then, you can follow us on our Twitter and Instagram pages at @TippingPointOAN or on my personal Twitter page, Nefertari_25. If you like the show, please send us feedback at tippingpoint@oann.com. Thank you and have a great night.